I'd like to say more today on how one can overcome jealousy. Now, I don't know whether you believe you've got a problem with jealousy. Most people do. And I have a problem with jealousy. That's why I wrote a book on it. And that's why we've been dealing with this subject over several weeks. Now, let me tell you the next step forward for many of us in how to overcome jealousy. And that is to anticipate your reward at the judgment seat of Christ. Now, I've referred to John chapter 5, verse 44 on this series, where Jesus asked the question, how can you believe who receive honor one of another and seek not the honor that comes from God only? The blessing of that verse is received here below, the reward that comes from God only, but also in heaven above. Now, I've written a book on this. It's called The Judgment Seat of Christ. When it first came out, it was called When God Says, Well Done. Now, here's my point. In a word, all who are saved will go to heaven when they die. But not all who are saved receive a reward at the judgment seat of Christ. And so, according to the Apostle Paul, some will be saved by fire, and they lose their reward. You read it in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. They lose their reward. Sometimes it's called prize, 1 Corinthians 9:24. Sometimes it's called crown, 2 Timothy 4, verse 8. And it's also called inheritance, Colossians 3, verse 24. Now, the crown is primarily hearing the Lord say, well done. I want that more than anything in the world. I want to hear him say that. But I know that there are those who say, and I've heard them, they've said it to me, they say, RT, I don't care whether I get a prize or a reward. I just want to make it to heaven. I know what they mean by that. But that is not a healthy Christian who talks like this. And I'll tell you another thing, you won't feel that way then when you're actually standing before God. Spend your life saying, I don't care whether I get a reward, I just want to make it to heaven. But when you're standing before him, it's going to be a fearful thing. And I can tell you now, Paul said we must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ and give an account of the things done in the body, whether they be good or bad. Well, never forget that this reward, prize, crown, inheritance, was very important to Paul. And when I think about that, that makes it very important indeed. He wasn't the slightest bit worried whether it's going to go to heaven. He knows it's going to go to heaven, but it was less sure of receiving that reward. And the proof of that is in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 27. He says, I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. 1 Corinthians 9:27, think about that verse. I'm going to ask you, how will you feel when all around you take off their crowns and lay them at Jesus' feet, and you have no crown at all? Well, now that reward will be given to those who endured persecution. Matthew chapter 5, verses 11 and 12. Those who blessed their enemies, as it's put, Luke 6:35. Those who dignified their trials, James 1:12, and eschewed the praise of people in order to obtain the sole honor of God. Back to John 5:44. Here's the thing. Everybody can receive an equal reward as anybody else at the judgment seat of Christ. Why? Because from everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. Luke 12:48. So the Apostle Paul was given much. I would say much more than I. Therefore, much more was required of him than of me. But if I am faithful in what God has entrusted me with, Paul was faithful in what God trusted him with, we will both receive the same reward. That encourages me, so you too. Even though Paul went hungry and thirsty and was brutally treated, he was homeless, he was cursed. You read it in 1 Corinthians 4, verses 11 and 12. He was beaten with rods. He received the 39 stripes 5 times. He was stoned, was in danger from bandits in the city, in the country, at sea. 2 Corinthians 11, verses 24 to 26. He founded churches and wrote virtually 2/3 of the books of the New Testament. Do you know what? You and I can have the same well done as Paul will get. Why? Well, did you have a Damascus Road vision of Jesus? Possibly not. Did you sit at the feet of Gamaliel? Probably not. Do you have Paul's knowledge, intellect, and head start? Probably not. But if you are faithful in what God has assigned to you, and you have done what was required of you, you're going to get the same reward as he got. Jesus said that the one who is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. Luke 16:10. That means you prove how you would have done in the much by how you did with the least. God requires more of some than others because they were given more to start with. When I know that I'm not required to write an epistle to the Romans because I've not been called to do that, I'm set free from being jealous of the one who did. You see, this whole program today, it's about how to overcome jealousy. But if I am jealous that, say, I'm not Jonathan Edwards or Charles Spurgeon, I prove I do not accept my own calling. I want theirs. And I'm asking Peter's question. You know, he asked this question when Jesus told him how he was to die, and all he could think about was John standing nearby. What about him? John 21:21. The Lord didn't like that. But if I will accept my own particular calling and be faithful in it, I will be rewarded on that day. It will be worth waiting for. But if I succumb to jealousy because I'm not content with the gifts I have, I will not only be miserable all my days here on earth, but I will sadly forfeit my reward at the judgment seat of Christ and be saved by fire. I don't want that. Well, I personally find that my greatest impetus to live a life that overcomes jealousy and is totally honoring to God is traced to the New Testament teaching on reward at the judgment seat of Christ. How we would blush in that day if it were revealed that the whole time in our lives we were governed by envy and jealousy like unsaved people are. Just remember, the lowest profile person that ever lived can have a reward equal to the highest profile person that ever lived. You could stand next to Billy Graham on that day and have confidence, 1 John 4:17, and not be envious of Billy. The dazzling truth alone ought to help you and me to overcome jealousy. Well, here's another way to overcome jealousy. Accept your calling. Now, accepting your calling means to embrace it gladly and not look beyond it. It means to resist looking over your shoulder to see what someone else's calling is. Listen to me. God made you, you. I cannot explain Einstein's theory of relativity. Maybe some of you can, I can't. But I know this much: there are no two things exactly alike in the universe. And our Creator God made everything, and everything He made is unique. You are unique. Nobody is like you. And it makes God happy when you accept what He has decided what is right for you. It makes Him happy when I have come to terms with my calling. So, I'll put it another way. It pleases God when you like yourself. Does that surprise you? But it's a compliment to Him that you like yourself, because He made you like that. He made you like that. As I said in my book, Totally Forgiving Ourselves, your heredity, parental influence, plus environment, that means experiences you grew up, plus the Holy Spirit equal the way God made you. And when you accept yourself as you are, with all the faults you have, we've all got them, but when you accept yourself as you are, it makes God happy. Well, never forget that your very ability, talent, hobby, interests, what comes easy for you and what grips you is not of your own making. God is behind it. You were being prepared for such a time as this, just as Esther was. Esther, chapter 4, verse 14, when it was said to her, God has brought you to the kingdom for such a time as this. And so this cuts out the ground for any boasting. Here's the question Paul put: who makes you different from anyone else? What do you have that you did not receive? And if you didn't receive it, why do you boast as though you did not? 1 Corinthians 4, verse 7. So we're talking now, in case you've just joined us, on how to overcome jealousy. And a way to do it is to accept your calling. Accept your calling means to affirm God's creation, His choice of parents for you, His will when and where you should be born, and how you should spend the whole of your life. You see, God has a calling for your life, one that is infinitely better or greater than you could have come up with on your own. And when you accept His will and His choice of a career or job, you're going to be at peace with yourself and lessen the temptation to envy or jealousy. All right, here's another way I would put it: how to overcome jealousy. Accept your inheritance. Now that's a word that's used in the Bible many ways, but what it means, as I will try to articulate it right now, coming to terms with the details of God's special plan for your life. You could say, I'm moving from the general to the particular. For example, God's will for Israel generally was that they would inherit the land of Canaan. But He also had a particular location for each tribe. And how do you suppose that was determined? It was determined by lot. Really, that may surprise you, but they cast lots. Each tribe had to accept the place where they should live. That was their inheritance. So the choice was out of their hands. God chose their inheritance. So with you, so with me, with each of us. For example, I was called into the ministry in 1954. I never forget it. 1954, it was in November, the day before Thanksgiving, 1954. A man by the name of John Logan. He was a Scottish preacher from near Glasgow, was preaching in Nashville, Tennessee. And I'd been praying for, well, 2 or 3 years to know whether I was called to preach. I didn't know at that time for sure. I heard of people having spectacular calling to preach. My close friend from Ashland, his name was Dale. He said that one day God says, "Dale, will you preach?" He heard a voice. And I thought, well, I want to make sure that I'm not going to miss it. And this Dr. John Logan from Glasgow happened to be in Nashville, and God gave me favor with him. And I got to have breakfast with him and spent some time with him. So one day I said to him, I need to know whether I'm called to preach. And he looked at me and said, "You are." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You are." I said, "But I want to know that I'm called to preach." He said, "You are." You know what? I believed it. I could see it. I believed it. And the thing that was kind of disappointing, it was so unspectacular. I wanted Michael the Archangel to come down and tell me. I wanted some vision. No, he just said, "You are," and I knew I had to accept it. Well, now here's my point. That was in 1954. I had no idea that in 1977, I would begin a 25-year ministry at Westminster Chapel in London. That was God's idea. It wasn't mine. God has an inheritance in mind for each of us. He has a plan for you. It is as detailed as His plan for me. We don't know very far in advance, if in advance at all, what that will be. There's a Southern gospel sing they used to have in Nashville, and I'm told that in Nashville it's the most popular song requested in hospitals. One day at a time, sweet Jesus. Well, Psalm 47 verse 4, I find it so emancipating. He chose our inheritance for us. So you think about that. God has a call on your life, and it takes the pressure off of us to figure it out or having to perform. I'll tell you this is so encouraging. God never sets a standard for us that we cannot reach. As St. Augustine prayed centuries ago, you know what he said? Command what thou wilt, give what you command. Think about that. Command what you will, give what you command. That means that God will supply the grace it takes to obey Him. He does not command us to do something and then sit back and with folded arms and to see what we're going to do. No, God isn't like that. He does command, but He then assists us to do what He told us to do. That's just the way He is. And when you get your pleasure from pleasing Him and then accept His choice of inheritance, whether it would mean living in London or Hong Kong, Nashville, or being a doctor, lawyer, preacher, secretary, flight attendant, lorry driver, office manager, postman, housewife, or nurse, you will be able to say, I promise, with David, the boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. Psalm 16, verse 6. So even if you're not called to be a king like David was, you will recall that John the Baptist was probably tempted to be jealous that Jesus was surpassing him in popularity. What did John say? Quote, a man can receive only what is given him from heaven. John 3:37. So here's my point. Accepting your inheritance. It's out of your hands. You just say, yes, Lord. Anyone else's inheritance, leave it with them. This means there's no room for justified jealousy. The buck stops with him. And if you could come to the place that you say, Lord, you didn't call me to be rich or famous. You didn't let me born into a family of aristocracy. I will never be royal. I will never be rich and famous. But it's okay, because when you face God one day, your reward, your being told, well done, will not be based upon whether you were rich or famous, whether you were royal or Billy Graham, or whether you were a nobody. We can all have the same reward, and it will mean everything at that time. But let me move to another principle. Remember that God decides what people should think of you. Maybe you need a moment for this. God has put a calling on how highly people should regard you. And if you try to raise that ceiling because you think they should admire you more, you violate His purpose. What is more, you will fail. The moment you do what will cause people to esteem you more, God will step in one way or the other to ensure that you are not admired too much. You will be admired less, I can guarantee it. You see, this is why the Apostle Paul was given what he calls thorn in the flesh. That's his phrase. It's in 2 Corinthians 12. He says, I needed it, and it kept him from being admired too much. And it also to protect Paul from himself, lest he take himself too seriously. That's why he stopped himself in saying more than he could have, lest someone should think more highly of him than is warranted by what he did or said. You read this in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 6. I can tell you, that's so interesting about Paul having a thorn in the flesh, lest people admire him too much. We all need it. In fact, one translation puts it, Paul was given a thorn in the flesh to keep him from being conceited. Look, Paul was an ambitious man, and he knew he needed a thorn in the flesh. And I need it, and you need it. Don't listen to me. Don't listen to anyone who says to you, as one person did, I won't tell you who, but it's pretty awful. I heard a man say, if the Apostle Paul had had my faith, he wouldn't have had a thorn in the flesh. Well, somebody said that. Nonsense. Horrible thing to say. But I can tell you this, we all need a thorn in the flesh. And I myself, I have learned a lesson not to admire anybody too much. In fact, it never fails. Every person that I began to admire a little bit too much, sooner or later disappointed me. So another lesson that I've learned is not to let people admire me too much. It's only a matter of time that I'm going to disappoint them. I don't know if you've ever pondered a verse like 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 6 for very long, but think about it. If you want to overcome jealousy, let this grip you. So Paul could say, I refrain from boasting so that no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say. Paul knew that God determines how highly Paul's own followers should esteem him. And he was nervous about doing anything that would violate that spiritual rule. Here's a good proverb for us to remember at this point. He says, let another praise you, not your own mouth, someone else and not from your own lips. Proverbs 27, verse 2. If God has decided what people should think of you, it follows that He has decided what people should think of others, including your friends and enemies. And if people are praising and admiring your enemy, let it happen. Don't dare raise a little finger to curb their admiration of that person. If God is allowing people to think highly of that person, perhaps one who's done you harm, that is His sovereign business. And if the world thinks highly of your enemy, leave it. Leave things alone. One of the most moving episodes in the life of King David is when David refused to stop a man by the name of Shimei from cursing him. Here's what David says: let him alone, let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will see my distress and repay me with goodness for the cursing I have been receiving today. 2 Samuel 16, verses 11 and 12. And so I urge you, don't manipulate regarding what people think of you. Don't try to control what people think of your enemy. Let God handle it. Well, what I'm trying to say today is how we can overcome jealousy. It comes down to this: affirming God for being God, accepting your calling, accepting your inheritance, because one day when we stand before God at the judgment seat of Christ, that's all that will matter, getting His reward. And you can know now that you're on target for that when you esteem the honor that comes from Him and not from people. That's it for today. God bless you until next time.